An old man with a cane walks into a gun store, met not with respect, but with laughter and mockery from the young clerks behind the counter. What they don't realize is that the silence he carries is heavier than any weapon in their display case. But when a dozen Navy SEALs step through that door without saying a word, everything changes. What connection do they have to this quiet stranger, and why do their eyes speak volumes when no one else will? Before we go any further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just be the one that leaves you speechless. Calvin Florentine pushed the glass door open with a creak that didn't belong to the door. The sound was small, but the clerks heard it anyway. Ethan Cole, barely 26, glanced up from behind the gun store's long oak counter with a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His eyes landed on the cane first, carved wood, worn smooth at the grip, then on the man leaning on it, moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who wasn't in a hurry to prove anything to anyone. Next to Ethan, Chad Renner elbowed him gently, not bothering to hide his grin. "Bet he's here for a BB gun," Chad muttered under his breath, loud enough for Ethan to hear, but not quite loud enough for the old man. Ethan snorted. "Nah, probably just here to remember the good old days." Calvin heard it. Not the words, exactly. He couldn't quite make them out, but he knew the tone. He'd heard it before, far too many times since his hair turned silver and his back began to bow. Disbelief, arrogance, dismissal. The young man's voice carried all three like badges of honor. He didn't stop walking, didn't even glance in their direction, just made his slow way along the sidewall, passing displays of rifles and antique revolvers, glass cases filled with the clean lines of precision machined steel. His cane tapped the floor with a rhythmic thud, like a heartbeat in wood. Ethan leaned an elbow on the counter, watching him. "You need help with something, sir?" he called, the word "sir" bending under the weight of his sarcasm. Calvin paused. The pause wasn't theatrical, it was practical. He always took a second to plant his footing before turning, ever since his right knee started giving out if he pivoted too fast. "No," he said, voice steady. "Just looking." Chad chuckled behind him. "Don't strain yourself, Grandpa. Some of those rifles are heavier than your cane." Ethan laughed. "We keep the Nerf guns in the back, if that's more your speed." Calvin didn't respond, didn't scowl, didn't react. He simply turned back to the case in front of him, eyes scanning the row of Winchester bolt actions like they were old friends. Chad leaned toward Ethan again, whispering louder this time. "You think he even knows what he's looking at?" "I think he's just bored," Ethan replied. "Probably wandered in from the park. Figured we'd give him a conversation." They both chuckled like boys in a locker room, feeding off each other's smugness. Behind them, a radio played a country song no one was listening to, and a ceiling fan stirred the still air like a lazy hand. The only other customer in the store, a bearded man in flannel, glanced over and then looked away, quickly, as if he didn't want to get involved. Calvin's hand reached out, slow, careful, and hovered just above the glass. He didn't touch it, never did. There was a respect for things in him that time hadn't eroded. His fingers curled slightly in midair, as though measuring the weight of memory more than the metal behind the case. He could still feel the cold grip of an M14 in the jungles of Laos, the sticky weight of sweat on his palms, the acrid stench of spent rounds and blood, the sharp, precise rhythm of orders followed and lives protected. He blinked, and the memory faded like smoke. Behind him, Ethan called again, this time with a mock politeness so thick it dripped. "Something specific you're looking for, sir? Or just reminiscing?" There was a silence then, not from Calvin, but from the air itself. That kind of silence that slips in like a hush over a grave. The kind of silence people feel more than hear. Calvin slowly turned, looked at the boy, because that's what Ethan was, really, and answered without raising his voice. "Looking, son, that okay with you?" Ethan's mouth twitched. There was something in Calvin's tone that made it hard to keep grinning, but he didn't let that stop him. Sure, just making sure you don't fall over trying to read the tags." Chad laughed again, louder now. The kind of laugh people use when they want others to join in, to make their side feel bigger. Calvin looked at him then, just looked. Not long, not hard, just long enough for Chad to feel a flash of something he couldn't name, that settled like cold steel against his chest. Calvin turned back to the rifles. Behind the counter, Ethan leaned over, voice low again. "You see the limp on him? Probably busted his hip getting out of bed too fast." Chad snickered. "You think he even remembers what year it is?" "Doubt he remembers what he came in for," Ethan said. "He'll probably forget he was here by lunch." They were too busy laughing to notice the man in the corner of the store, behind the shelving unit near the handguns, putting down the scope he'd been examining. He was tall, built like stone, with a jaw that looked like it had taken and thrown a punch or two. He hadn't said a word since he entered 10 minutes earlier, and now, without a word, he reached for his phone and tapped out a message. Calvin moved down the row, now at the shotguns. His gait was slow, sure, like a man on patrol. Not shopping, not wasting time, but observing, evaluating. Not for what he wanted to buy, but for what others chose to sell. The clerks hadn't stopped. They were louder now, not caring if Calvin heard, not thinking he mattered. Their mockery became the soundtrack of the moment, low, juvenile, ignorant, until the bell above the front door jingled. Just once. Ethan barely looked up. Then he did a double take. A man had entered, not tall but broad in the shoulders, clean haircut, tactical posture. His eyes scanned the store once and landed on Calvin. He gave the slightest nod, barely noticeable. Then the door opened again, and again. Chad turned toward the sound and counted them without thinking. 2, 4, 6. By the time the 12th man stepped inside, the gun store felt suddenly much smaller. They didn't say a word. They didn't touch the merchandise. They didn't even glance at the clerks. They only stood, 12 men in civilian clothes, each one clearly military by bearing, build, and discipline. They formed no formation, no line. But they stood, spread just wide enough to surround the store, close enough to each other that the air shifted. Ethan straightened. Can I help you fellas?" No one answered. Calvin didn't look at them, didn't smile, didn't move. The man who had entered first walked toward him, slow, casual. His boots made solid sounds on the linoleum. When he reached Calvin's side, he stopped and stood at ease, hands clasped in front, eyes forward. Another man followed, then another, until all 12 stood silently, surrounding Calvin Florentine without ever touching him. Like a wall, like a shield, like memory taking form. Ethan swallowed. Chad didn't speak. No one did. And in that heavy silence, filled not with words but with presence, Calvin finally turned. Not to the clerks, not to the rifles, but to the man at his side. They exchanged no words, only a nod. And then Calvin turned back to the case of rifles, as if nothing had happened at all. The silence didn't break. It shifted, not shattered, not disturbed, just bent under the weight of uncertainty, the kind that made men like Ethan and Chad look at each other, not because they needed answers, but because they suddenly remembered they had none. The SEALs stood like statues, 12 men, different builds, different faces, but with the same stillness that came only from training. Serious, coordinated, lifelong training. They weren't armed, at least not visibly, but no one doubted that they could take control of the room if they wanted to. Ethan cleared his throat, tried to summon his voice, and managed something close to normal. If you gentlemen need anything? The first man through the door, the one now standing just behind Calvin, didn't even turn his head. His jaw shifted slightly, chewing on silence. Ethan stopped. No one else moved. Chad's mouth hung half open as he scanned their faces. Most were clean-shaven, a few bore stubble. A couple wore ball caps, one had wrap-around shades resting on the top of his head. All of them looked like they could snap a man in half without blinking. Not one of them had taken a step toward the counter. Not one had acknowledged the store's employees. They were there for him. That old man, that ghost with a cane and a stare. Ethan felt his throat tighten, and for reasons he couldn't explain, his fingers twitched toward the edge of the counter, like maybe he could hold onto something solid. But the counter felt thin, hollow, like the barrier it pretended to be had suddenly stopped existing. Chad whispered, "What the hell is this?" Ethan didn't answer, because he didn't know. Calvin didn't say anything either. He simply adjusted his footing ever so slightly, as if the presence of the men had changed the balance of gravity in the room. His cane didn't tap the ground. His shoulders stayed relaxed. But his eyes, when they finally lifted from the case of rifles, met the reflection in the glass. 12 men behind him, like shadows with purpose. One of the SEALs finally moved. It wasn't a grand gesture. He just stepped to the side, clearing the path between Calvin and the counter, as if reconfiguring the room without ever asking permission. And then he spoke. "We heard something about an old man not knowing what he's looking at." The voice was deep, smooth, unhurried. It didn't rise in volume, didn't carry a threat, but it didn't need to. Chad went pale. Ethan felt the air in his lungs stall. For a moment he considered laughing it off, pretending it was all just a misunderstanding, a joke, but the way that man had said it, without lifting his chin or narrowing his eyes, made it clear. There was no misinterpretation, only memory. Calvin turned then, just enough to glance over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, somehow, had softened. "Easy," he said, "not to the clerks, to the men." One of them, tall, lean, with a scar cutting through the stubble on his cheek, spoke next. "Not here to make trouble, Cap. That word." Ethan blinked. So did Chad. Another man stepped forward, younger than the others, broad chest, close-cropped hair, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. He looked straight at Ethan and Chad, his jaw working like he was grinding his own patience. "This man," he said, motioning toward Calvin with an open palm, "led us through fire more than once. There are men walking around today, raising families, because he didn't walk away when things went sideways." He paused. "You think his cane makes him small? That limp makes him weak? You have no damn clue what you're looking at." His words didn't explode. They sank, heavy, rooted in something deeper than pride. Ethan wanted to respond. He even opened his mouth. But nothing came out. Another man stepped forward. His eyes scanned the store like he was still on patrol. Then he spoke, voice low but piercing. "I was pinned under debris in Al-Fallujah. Everyone else thought I was gone. Calvin pulled me out, carried me 200 yards through sniper fire." He didn't say it like it was a story. He said it like it was the weather. Inevitable, factual, beyond debate. Calvin shook his head, almost to himself. "You boys don't need to be doing this." "Yes, we do," came the answer. Another one stepped up, this time from the left side of the group. Shorter, stockier, red in the face. "You remember Corporal Diaz, sir? That mission outside Kandahar? You dragged him across 3 clicks of desert after that IED took out the lead truck." Calvin's lips pressed together in a thin line. "He didn't make it." "Wouldn't have made it at all if you hadn't tried." It settled like stone. Ethan's arms had gone cold. He glanced at Chad, who now looked like he was standing in a courtroom awaiting sentencing. The man who had first spoken to them turned his eyes back on Ethan. "You see wrinkles and a cane. We see the man who refused to abandon us, even when it meant bleeding beside us." Chad finally found his voice. It was weak but audible. "We didn't know." "No," the SEAL said, stepping forward again. "You didn't care to." The silence returned. Not heavy this time. Sharp. Like glass between breaths. One of the SEALs pulled something from his pocket. A small patch, faded and worn. He placed it gently on the glass counter. Ethan stared down. It was a special warfare insignia. The SEAL trident, old and weathered, the gold dimmed with time. "This belonged to the man who taught us the meaning of silence," he said, "of resolve, of brotherhood." Ethan stared at it. He couldn't move. Chad looked like he wanted to vanish. Calvin turned fully now, facing the room. "Gentlemen," he said to the SEALs, his voice calm but lined with something firmer than steel, "I appreciate it, but let's not turn this into more than it is." Another of the men, older, with a sleeve tattoo running down one arm, responded, "No, sir. It's exactly what it is. Respect overdue." Then he looked straight at Ethan and said, "You should thank him." Ethan's tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Everything in him squirmed, not from guilt, but from the truth of it. He stepped out from behind the counter, slow, unsure. "I'm sorry," he managed. "Pierce." It didn't sound enough, but it was the first honest thing he'd said all morning. Calvin gave a nod, not accepting the apology, not rejecting it, just acknowledging that it was spoken. The man who had placed the trident on the counter turned toward Calvin. "Sir, we'll be outside if you need anything." Calvin smiled then, just a little. "I know." The 12 men moved like shadows again, weaving between displays, heading toward the door without looking back. When the bell chimed as they exited, it sounded different, softer somehow. Calvin lingered. He walked to the counter slowly, cane tapping. His hand reached out, again hovering over the glass. Then, finally, tapped it lightly near the old trident. He looked at Ethan. "You ever worn something like that?" Ethan shook his head. "You ever bled for the guy next to you, not knowing if you'd make it?" "No," Ethan admitted. "Then maybe next time, don't assume." And with that Calvin turned, walked past the racks of rifles, past the stunned silence of the few remaining customers, and toward the front door, where 12 shadows waited in the sun. Outside, the SEALs had formed a loose semicircle by the parking lot, not in formation, not formal, but protective. There was an unspoken rhythm between them, one Calvin Florentine didn't interrupt as he stepped through the door. The sun hit his eyes, and he paused beneath the overhang, letting his gaze move from man to man. Some he hadn't seen in years, others he'd never met in combat, but they all wore the same look. The one that said, "You don't walk alone." The last man to exit the store was the younger one with the hard jaw and quiet fury. Caleb Marsh. He paused beside Calvin, speaking low enough that only the older man could hear. "They had no idea, sir, no clue." "I'm not looking for recognition," Calvin replied, eyes forward. "Never was." "I know," Caleb said, "but you damn well deserve it." Calvin didn't answer, not right away. His hand tightened slightly on the cane, a reflex more than anything else. Inside, the air had been heavy. Now, under the open sky, it was easier to breathe, but not easier to forget. Another SEAL stepped forward, nodding toward the pickup parked in the corner of the lot. "We brought something, you should see it." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "A parade float?" The group chuckled softly. It wasn't loud, wasn't forced, just genuine. The sound of men who'd shared more than foxholes and fallout. They guided Calvin to the truck bed, and one of them pulled back the canvas cover with care. Inside was a sealed wooden crate, a smooth American walnut finish, edges reinforced in black metal. On the side was a simple engraving: LT, CMDR, C, Florentine, Ret. Caleb stepped up and unlatched the crate. Inside, cushioned in black velvet, was a rifle. Not modern, not flashy. A restored M14, pristine, polished, every line familiar. Calvin's breath caught, but not for the reasons the younger men imagined. It wasn't nostalgia. It was weight. That weapon had once been the extension of his will, his defense, his obligation. Seeing it again, reborn, was like coming face to face with a version of himself long buried. "Had it restored," Caleb said. "Use the serial number from your last unit-issued weapon. Took some digging." "You been busy," Calvin murmured, running a hand just above the stock but never touching. "Couldn't let the past sit in a crate somewhere forgotten," Caleb replied. "That's not how you taught us." Behind them the others stood quiet, some with hands clasped in front of them, others with arms crossed over their chests. Not watching a show, bearing witness. Calvin finally touched the rifle, just a fingertip tracing the rear sight. A flood of memories surged forward, names, coordinates, nights under fire, the metallic snap of magazines loaded in haste. The rifle wasn't a weapon, it was history in wood and steel. "I don't know what to say," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "You don't need to say anything, sir," Caleb said. "We just thought, after what happened in there, maybe the world needs reminding." Calvin looked toward the store. Through the front windows, he could see Ethan and Chad moving like ghosts. They hadn't left. They hadn't spoken again. But their faces now carried the dull shock of men who'd seen something they didn't understand and couldn't explain. Calvin turned back to the SEALs. "You boys didn't come all this way just to babysit an old man, did you?" Caleb smiled. "No, sir. We came because someone lit the signal flare. Word got around. Took all of 20 minutes before we were piling in trucks." "Signal flare?" "Jim Sata." That name hit Calvin like a drop of cold water on the back of the neck. His eyes narrowed. "He's still around." "Runs the place," Caleb replied. "Or used to. Took a leave a few weeks back after some surgery. But when he heard about what went down here, he made a few calls." Calvin grunted. That man never could keep his mouth shut. "Nope," Caleb said, "but he always knew when to open it." They stood for a few minutes without speaking. The sun moved a little higher, casting long, lean shadows over the asphalt. Calvin rested his hand on the edge of the truck bed and glanced sidewise at Caleb. "You've grown up." Caleb looked down, suddenly sheepish. "Some days I still feel 20 and dumb." "You survived. That's more than most." Caleb nodded once. "Because of you?" That settled like gravel in the chest. Rough but grounding. Calvin gave the smallest nod back, his eyes distant. "The job was never to make it home. The job was to make sure you did." "And we did," another SEAL added from behind them. "Thanks to you. You carried more than gear out there. You carried all of us." Calvin turned slightly and looked at the group again. Their faces were different than he remembered. Older, harder. But the posture, the way they stood, the silence they wore, it hadn't changed. "You know," he said slowly, "there was a time I thought all this would disappear. That when we came back, it'd just fade." "Not while we're still breathing," Caleb said. "Yeah," another chimed in. "You raised a generation of warriors, sir. We don't forget." Calvin looked down at the crate again. He didn't need the rifle. Not to shoot, not to carry. But something in the gesture stuck deeper than any medal ever pinned to his chest. A man remembers what he passed down when he sees it living in others. Behind them, tires crunched on gravel. A black SUV pulled into the lot. The driver's window rolled down, and a familiar voice called out. "Well, hell, looks like I missed the fireworks." Calvin turned and saw him. Jim Sutter. Thick-shouldered, gray-bearded, walking with a slight limp of his own as he stepped from the vehicle. His jacket bore a faded Marine Corps patch near the cuff. He didn't walk fast, but his presence filled the space like he never left. Caleb stepped back, giving space. Jim approached Calvin, arms folded, mouth tight. "Don't tell me I gotta chew out a couple punks for you." Calvin smirked. "You're late." Jim laughed once. "Rough and short. I move at my own speed now. Doc says if I run, something'll fall off." The two old men stared at each other for a moment, years of memory rising between them like a tide. Then Jim's face softened. "You okay?" Calvin nodded. "Yeah. I got wind of it yesterday. Thought maybe it was exaggeration, but then I saw the footage." "Footage?" Jim gestured toward the store. Kid behind the counter forgot to disable the security cam mic. One of my managers recorded it. Was all over veteran message boards before lunch. Alvin let out a slow breath. "So, that's how this started." Caleb called me. I made one call. Then 12 trucks started moving. Calvin looked around. "Feels like overkill." Jim leaned in. "That's the point." Behind them, the SEALs stood in silent respect, not waiting for orders, not lingering for thanks, just standing where they needed to be. Calvin looked at them one more time. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I thought when I got old I'd just disappear into quiet." "You tried," Jim said, "but you underestimated the noise you left behind." The wind moved across the lot, lifting dust and leaves. Calvin stepped back from the crate, looked at Caleb. "You keep it," he said, motioning to the rifle. "Let it keep doing good." Caleb hesitated. "Sir, I can't." "It's not mine anymore, it's ours. Carry it well." Caleb nodded, the lump in his throat too thick for thanks. The silence stretched again, and this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Inside the store, the silence still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Ethan stood near the counter, one hand braced on the glass, the other hanging awkwardly at his side. Chad had retreated toward the back, pretending to rearrange a shelf of scopes he'd already straightened twice. Neither of them said anything. Not to each other, not to the few customers who came and went quickly, glancing around as if they'd stumbled into something sacred. The trident patch still sat on the counter. Neither of them dared touch it. Outside, the group remained gathered around Calvin Florentine like a circle of ghosts made flesh, men whose presence told a story without a single word needing to be spoken. From the inside, watching them, they didn't look like customers. They looked like guardians. Ethan finally moved. Slowly, purposefully. He stepped around the counter, walked toward the door, then hesitated. His reflection in the glass stopped him. The boy who had laughed an hour ago didn't look the same anymore. Something in his eyes was smaller now. Or maybe it had never been as big as he thought it was. Chad called out, voice subdued. "What are you doing?" Ethan didn't look back. "I'm going to talk to him." "About what? You already said sorry." "Not for real." Chad didn't respond. He just watched him go. The bell above the door gave a hollow chime as Ethan stepped outside. The men turned. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to let him know he was being watched. He cleared his throat. "Sir?" "Mr. Florentine." Calvin turned his head slightly, his eyes calm but unreadable. I wanted to say it again, properly this time. I didn't know who you were." "What you did?" Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Does it matter who I was?" Ethan hesitated. "I think it does now." Calvin didn't answer. Behind him, Caleb Marsh stepped forward and crossed his arms. He didn't speak, but his presence alone made Ethan shift uncomfortably. Calvin finally sighed and stepped a little closer. "It's not about who I was, son. It's about what you think people stop being when they get old. You looked at me and saw a burden." Ethan's throat bobbed. "I saw someone slow. I thought, you looked like someone who didn't belong." Ethan nodded, quietly, shame tightening every syllable. Calvin studied him for a moment. "You ever carry a man out of a fire zone? Ever hear the whistle of incoming mortars and not know if you'd get to the next breath?" "No, sir. I don't expect you to, but maybe next time you see someone walking with a cane, ask yourself what they walked through before they needed it." Ethan swallowed hard, then nodded. Behind Calvin, another SEAL spoke up. "I was 23 when I met him. Thought I knew everything. Then we took fire in Kandahar and I froze. Calvin knocked me to the ground and dragged me behind cover. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just said, 'You move when you're ready. I'm not leaving.' That one sentence saved my life." Caleb added. "He once volunteered to stay behind during an evac because one of our guys was wounded and we didn't have enough stretchers. Stayed hidden in the dark for 6 hours. Didn't move. Didn't sleep. Just kept pressure on a leg wound so the kid didn't bleed out." Ethan's eyes darted from one man to the next, each of them holding a fragment of a story he'd never imagined. The picture forming in his mind didn't match the quiet, hunched man who'd walked in earlier that day. That man had been underestimated by everyone, including him. Chad emerged from the store, slowly approaching, hands in his pockets. "That true?" he asked. "You really stayed behind? Alone?" Calvin turned toward him. "Would have done it again." Chad shifted. "I've got family in the Corps. My cousin's in Okinawa right now." He told me stories like that, but I always thought, that it was just legend. "It's not legend," Caleb said. "It's people like Calvin who wrote the parts of history no one prints in textbooks." Jim Sutter joined the group then, walking up with that slow, grounded step of someone who'd learned to save his energy for when it counted. His face was drawn but sharp, and his eyes fell on Ethan and Chad like a quiet storm brewing behind his ribcage. "I built this place to be a space of respect," Jim said, voice low, "not just for the people who come through the door with cash, but for those who already paid in other ways." Ethan looked down. "We messed up." Jim didn't reply right away. He let the silence do what words couldn't. Then finally he said, "You two are young. That's not a crime. But if you're going to work in a place like this, you better learn what kind of ground you're standing on." Chad muttered, "We didn't mean any harm." Jim tilted his head. "That's the thing about harm. It doesn't care whether you meant it or not." Calvin raised a hand slightly. "They've said their piece." Jim studied him. "You sure you want to let 'em off that easy?" "I didn't come here for retribution," Calvin said. "I came for ammo, left with a reminder." Chad looked up, puzzled. "A reminder?" That no matter how quiet you get in this life, someone's still watching. The good, the bad, the indifferent. And some debts, they're not forgotten. Not by the men you served with, and not by the ones who should have known better. Caleb stepped beside Calvin, adjusting the strap on his shoulder. "We don't follow you because you bark orders. We follow you because you never stop earning our respect." Jim gave a soft grunt. "Well, now they know, if they didn't before." Ethan turned to Jim. "You gonna fire us?" Jim looked him over, top to bottom, then turned to Calvin. "What do you think?" Calvin raised an eyebrow. "You asking me to do your job now?" Jim shrugged. "Just saying. You've led bigger groups than me." Calvin turned to Ethan and Chad, his eyes steady. "Keep 'em." Chad blinked. "What? Why?" Calvin took a deep breath. Because next time an old man walks in, they'll remember today. And maybe that'll be worth more than a pink slip. The two young men stood quiet, unsure whether to thank him or apologize again. Caleb broke the tension with a slight smile. Now that we've covered humility training, anyone hungry? A few of the SEALs chuckled and one slapped Caleb on the back. Only if you're paying. I figured the gun store would cover it, Caleb joked. Jim laughed. Not on my dime. Calvin turned, already walking away from the group. I've got a better idea. He stopped at the edge of the parking lot, looking back at the open plains beyond the store, where the sun was starting to dip toward the western horizon. Come with me, he said. There's a place I go when I need to remember why I came back. The men nodded, no questions, no hesitation. Because when Calvin Florentine asked, you didn't wonder why. You just followed. The road Calvin took wasn't marked by signs or lines. It twisted off the main highway and wound through a series of gravel shoulders and faded asphalt, leading into an open stretch of grassland that most had long forgotten. The trucks followed him at a respectful distance, tires crunching softly over dirt and gravel, windows down, radios off. The kind of silence men keep not because they've been ordered to, but because it feels right. When Calvin stopped, it was at a clearing bordered by a low fence and a rusting steel flagpole that still caught the wind just enough to make it hum. The grass had been mowed recently. The path was lined with old stones, some marked, some not, and a wooden bench, aged and splintered but still standing, sat facing west. It wasn't a cemetery, though it had that feel. It was a place carved out of the noise, kept private by time and reverence. He got out slowly, cane tapping as he made his way toward the bench. The others followed behind him, spreading out as if by instinct. No one needed to be told what this was. This was where I came after I got home, Calvin said, lowering himself to the bench with a quiet grunt. Sat right here the night I realized I had no one left who would ask where I'd been. No one answered, but not out of discomfort. They just knew that the space between his words needed room to breathe. My unit used to call it Echo Hill, he continued. We'd come out here on weekends when we weren't deployed, little fire pit, some bad whiskey. We'd tell lies and laugh about stuff that used to scare the hell out of us. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was the only place I didn't have to be a commander. I could just be. Caleb Marsh sat on the ground nearby, knees up, arms resting casually across them. You never told us about this. Not everything needs telling, Calvin said. Some things are just for keeping. One of the other SEALs, an older man named Pierce with a shaved head and thick hands, nodded toward the flagpole. Looks like someone still comes out here. Calvin gave a short nod. Couple local boys keep it clean. One of them lost a cousin in Fallujah. Says this place feels more sacred than the cemetery. The wind stirred again, and the flag above gave a brief flutter. Tired, but proud. Ethan and Chad arrived a few minutes later in Ethan's dusty sedan, parking a respectful distance away. They stepped out, unsure, the weight of their earlier actions still heavy, but now mixed with something more complicated. Curiosity, maybe. Or the start of something like reverence. Jim Sutter followed them in his SUV, pulling in next to the last truck. He climbed out slower than the others, his body still stiff from years of wear, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He walked up beside Calvin, hands in his jacket pockets. You told me once you'd buried your ghosts, Jim said. I didn't think you meant out here. I didn't bury them, Calvin replied. I gave them a place to sit with me. Jim gave a quiet grunt. He looked around the clearing, nodding slowly. Feels right. Calvin gestured to a stone near the bench. Small, flat, unmarked. That's where Danny used to sit. Never wanted a headstone, just a rock to lean on. Danny? Ethan asked gently from behind them. Sergeant Daniel Knox, Calvin said without looking back. He was my radio man in I-3. Took a hit from shrapnel after an IED. Bled out before the bird could land. He was 24. The words were plain, not embellished, not emotional, but each one struck with the weight of a hammer. Ethan stepped forward. "I'd like to know more, if that's okay." Calvin looked up at him for a long moment, then nodded. Danny used to keep a pocket Bible in his vest. Said his grandma gave it to him. Never read it, far as I could tell, but he said it reminded him that someone back home believed he was more than a uniform. When he died, I mailed it back to her. She wrote me a letter after. Told me that for years she had nightmares about how he went. Said my letter gave her the first peaceful sleep she'd had since he enlisted. Ethan's throat tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Calvin leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "There's a price to leading. People think it's all orders and rank, but it's not. It's memory. It's looking into the eyes of someone's son and wondering if today's the day you send them into a fire they won't walk out of." Caleb's voice came quietly, "And yet you carried us through." Calvin didn't answer. Jim looked out at the horizon, the sun slowly falling behind a line of trees in the distance. "You ever think about writing all this down, telling your story?" Calvin shook his head. "My story's not special. Everyone out there has one. Mine just lasted longer than most." Pierce added, "But it matters, sir, especially now. Too many people out there thinking war's just a word or a movie." Chad stepped forward. "It's not." Everyone turned toward him. His voice cracked a little, but he kept speaking. "My cousin came back from Afghanistan. Never talked about it, never looked people in the eye again. He used to hunt and fish and coach Little League. Now he just sits on the porch. I used to think he was being dramatic, lazy even, but now I think I just didn't understand." Calvin looked at him, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You starting to?" he said. Chad nodded. "I think so." Another breeze moved through the grass. The leaves rustled softly. The kind of sound that made a man feel both small and held. Jim clapped a hand on Calvin's shoulder. "You did more than lead. You left something behind in all of them. That's legacy." Calvin exhaled slowly. "Legacy's not a thing you chase. It's what's left when you're done doing the right thing long enough." The men stood there for a while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky. No one asked to leave. No one looked at their watches. The world, for a few precious minutes, seemed to turn slower. And when the sun dipped fully below the tree line, Calvin stood. Not fast, not like he used to, but with purpose. He turned to the men who had followed him through wars, through memory, through silence, and gave them a nod that said more than any speech could. They didn't salute him. Not yet. Not here. That moment was still coming. The sun had dipped fully beyond the horizon by the time the group returned to the gun store. The sky was turning that deep purplish blue that comes just before true nightfall, and the parking lot lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows from the trucks now parked in a quiet line. It wasn't crowded anymore. The customers were gone, and the road out front had grown still, as if the world understood something meaningful had unfolded and was respectfully keeping its distance. Calvin Florentine was the last to step out of Jim's SUV. His cane touched the pavement, followed by the measured rhythm of his boots. No one offered to help him, not because they didn't want to, but because they knew better. Calvin didn't need an arm. He needed space, and every man present understood that unspoken code. The 12 SEALs stood in a wide half-circle just outside the front entrance of the shop. They hadn't planned it. No one had called it out. But something in their movements had become synchronized from years of shared dirt and danger. They spread out like anchors to a memory. Ethan and Chad stood to the side just beyond the double doors, their expressions quiet and unreadable. They hadn't gone home. They hadn't run from their shame or discomfort. They stayed because somewhere deep inside, they knew they needed to see this through. Calvin reached the edge of the circle and stopped. There were no medals in his hands, no ceremony scripted, just silence, thick and complete, folding over the gathering like a flag being lowered for the night. One of the SEALs stepped forward. It was Caleb. In his hands was a folded item wrapped in olive canvas. He held it out to Calvin with both palms. Calvin didn't move right away. His eyes fell on the item, then lifted to Caleb's face. "What's this now?" he asked, his voice more gravel than breath. Caleb's eyes glistened, but didn't break. "A gift. From all of us." Calvin took it gently, unwrapping the fabric with the same reverence one might give a sacred relic. Inside was a shadow box framed in oak, holding a single ribbon, a weathered set of dog tags, and a brass nameplate that simply read, BC MDR, Calvin Florentine. Steady in the storm. Calvin stared at it longer than anyone expected. Long enough that even the wind seemed to pause. "I didn't earn this," he murmured. "You earned it every damn day," said Pierce. Calvin looked up. His hand went to the tags inside the glass. "These aren't mine." "They are now," Caleb said. "We had them made. Every tag represents someone you pulled out, someone who made it home because of you. Every man here signed off on it." Calvin nodded once, sharply, like it hurt too much to do anything more. He looked around at the circle of men. "You don't salute an old man in a parking lot," he said, trying for humor. But they didn't smile, and they didn't wait. As if on cue, each SEAL took a single step forward, boots landing firm, heels clicking together, and one by one, each man raised a hand to his brow and delivered a silent, unwavering salute. Ethan swallowed hard. Chad's hands were clenched tight by his sides. Even Jim stood at attention. Calvin's shoulders straightened slightly, as if decades fell away for just a moment. He returned the salute, not out of pride, but out of obligation, out of acknowledgement for what these men were giving him. For the first time that day, his voice carried real command. "At ease, boys." The salutes dropped as the men relaxed, but the gravity in the air remained. And slowly something else shifted. One of the SEALs, tall, with a face carved by time and war, stepped forward. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old folded photo. It was faded, the edges worn. He handed it to Calvin without a word. Calvin unfolded it. It was a picture of his first unit, taken in Iraq mid-2000s. They were all smiling, dirty, sunburned, tired, but smiling. He stared at it long and hard. Some of those faces were gone. Some were standing in front of him now. "I didn't know you had this," Calvin said. "Been keeping it safe?" the SEAL replied. "Figured it was time you had it back." Calvin gave the smallest of nods. "Thank you," he said, "for not forgetting." "We remember everything," Caleb said, "especially the quiet stuff." The group slowly began to disperse. Some clapped Calvin gently on the shoulder. Others gave him a nod or a handshake that lingered just long enough to say what words couldn't. It wasn't noisy. No congratulations, no speeches, just the sound of boots against pavement and a few murmured goodbyes. Eventually, only a few remained. Calvin, Jim, Caleb, Ethan, and Chad. The younger clerk stepped forward. "We'd like to make something right," Ethan said, "if it's not too late." Calvin gave them a long look. "What do you have in mind?" Chad reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "We talked with Jim. We want to rename the veterans section of the store. We're calling it Florentine Row. Put up your service photo, maybe a little write-up, the whole display." Calvin blinked, stunned. "You sure that's not too much?" "It's not nearly enough," Jim replied. Calvin stared at the envelope for a moment, then nodded, slowly. "Unher," he said softly. "But put up their names, too, the ones who didn't come home." "You got it," Chad said, already writing that into his notes on his phone. The small group walked back toward the store together. Ethan unlocked the door and they stepped into the dim quiet of the shop. It felt different now, less transactional, more hallowed. Calvin moved toward the counter, looked around slowly. Then, in a voice calm and grounded, he said, "Feels like something sacred was put back in place today." Jim smiled. "Maybe this time, it'll stay there." Calvin didn't linger. He knew when to leave a place well. After a final handshake with Ethan and a clap on the back for Caleb, he turned toward the door. His cane tapped once, twice, and then stopped. He looked back. "You boys take care of this place. You never know who's going to walk through that door." "We will, sir," Ethan said. "Promise." Calvin stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face. The stars were out now, wide and unfiltered. He took a breath, deep, steady, and walked into the night. No fanfare, no final speech. Just a man who had walked through fire, returned through silence, and left behind something far louder than words. And this time the world had seen it.